Euthanasia is a highly complicated and actually quite emotive topic. And I think one of the really important things to acknowledge straight away is that both sides are coming at it with, I think, right intentions, but obviously reflecting my own views, I oppose it. But why I say euthanasia is complex is often in the public discourse it's just one word, and often it's misunderstood for what it actually means. I mean, if you, like me, have studied Greek, you know that it means good death. But euthanasia is, in a sense, can be thought of in two ways. Euthanasia strictly is about the doctor ending a patient's life. They take a lethal injection and end a patient's life. Not without sedation first and muscle relaxants, because as I've often pointed out, you don't want the person wriggling or fighting back. But actually, it's interesting, there's a number of cases overseas where patients have. But yeah, euthanasia strictly is where the doctor administers a lethal injection intentionally to end one's life. The other side of it, sometimes called physician-assisted suicide or just assisted suicide, is where you yourself take a drug or often a big dose of a liquid, a barbital usually, to end your life. So a doctor still has to fill out a prescription and you go and collect the lethal drugs, but you choose to end your own life. So in the New Zealand context, we're actually talking about both. And that's really important because in a lot of overseas jurisdictions, you only have either euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. So Belgium, only doctors will terminate your life. In Oregon, you collect the pills and choose the timing to take your own life. In fact, most don't, but in New Zealand, we're talking about both. So this is quite broad. In fact, you can make the argument it's the broadest in the world. But fundamentally, it's about choosing to end your life. It's a suicidal tendency, I would argue, that's sometimes been seen as controversial. But you know, I'm a philosopher at heart, and you just get right down to definitions. And ending one's life prematurely is a suicide. This debate, therefore, around euthanasia is whether there are exceptions, whether suicide is acceptable. I say no. I say that's never an appropriate response. The other side would say actually it is appropriate under certain circumstances, particularly around the end of life, terminal illness. But I'd point out as well, with this particular bill before Parliament, it's not just about terminal illness. Euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, is also about grievous conditions, irremediable conditions. If anyone's had a background in the health field, and I have, those are very broad terms, actually quite ambiguous, but also importantly, and not often talked about, it's also about suffering which the person deems intolerable. So now you're moving out of sort of objective quantifiable realms into what a person subjectively feels about their life. So it's a fascinating area, and I say that because actually from let's say a purely academic point of view, it is fascinating as you weigh up the different arguments, but it's also deadly serious because we're talking about life and death and ultimately creating a category of New Zealanders where ending their life, where a form of suicide is going to be made acceptable.
And we'll get to, I mean, specifically, you mentioned Clause 4 in your speech before Parliament not too long ago. But we'll get to that soon and after that. But what is this bill in its essence? Can you explain this bill?
This bill is an evolution of other bills that have actually come before Parliament to legalise euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. But this is probably the most permissive or wide-ranging bill. So ultimately it's allowing New Zealanders to end their lives and in pretty broad circumstances. So it's a little bit different to other bills that have come before Parliament. So first and foremost, it is euthanasia, so the doctor kills you, or physician-assisted suicide where you effectively end your own life. That's incredibly broad compared to other jurisdictions in the world. And the second element is that the reasons and conditions that you can seek to end your life is very broad, or at the very least the bill is very ambiguous with its definitions.
Well, what groups is that bill going to serve?
I would make the argument it actually affects all New Zealanders, and by that I'm not saying that every New Zealander is eligible for euthanasia or assisted suicide under this bill, But it will affect it'll affect everyone because we all get caught up in it in one way or another. And secondly, it will affect a broad range of people. So certainly the terminally ill, and that's more than people simply at 12 or 18 months. Terminal illness can start at quite an early stage. But it's also going to capture those with chronic illnesses and really importantly the disabled community, and they're pretty much up in arms because this bill allows them to end their lives, and it is for them, and I can't easily speak for the disabled community, it's always best to talk to them, but they've said to me that it's basically saying that their lives aren't worth living because they immediately fit into this bill to say that, yep, your life not really worth living, you should be able to end it. So it's making a value judgment about them.
At the first reading, you said the words, the worst example of euthanasia in the world. Can you explain that and back that up?
Yeah, so I made the statement in the Parliament or in the House that this is the worst example simply because it's so broad. I suppose it's even the encouragement I put to people who are pro-euthanasia to look at this as so broad compared to other places in the world. So again, first and foremost, it's both the doctor killing you or you choosing to kill yourself. That's unusual in other jurisdictions, to have both. And also the conditions are so broad, not just terminal illness. A lot of the debate focuses on terminal illness, but the bill is so much broader than that. You just have to ask yourself the question, what is a grievous and irremediable condition? And that's rather difficult to define. And then, as I always point out, the bill also talks about suffering which you deem intolerable. So it's moving it very quickly, I would suggest, to the area that you decide that you've just had enough of life.
Why not vote to send it to select committee then in that case for review?
Personally, I think the bill is completely flawed and no select committee process or hours of political thought are going to be able to fix it. I think the bill is deeply flawed. First and foremost from a legal perspective. A lot of it again comes down to its vagary and ambiguity. But also I led the largest parliamentary inquiry in history, or the New Zealand Parliament's history. 21,000 people writing and experts from all sides. So for me personally, I've seen all the arguments, I've looked at all the evidence, I know what I think, and therefore was able to make a very definitive decision at the first reading.
Why, obviously when you first learn to start debating, you've got to learn how to debate for and you've got to learn how to debate against, even though it may be hard. Why would it be necessary? Or, and put yourself in that shoe, that in a concrete case, why would it be necessary to have?
Well, first and foremost, I don't think it is ever necessary. I suppose my academic and philosophical background is that you never argue from exceptions. And so even if you found the absolute exceptional case, that's not a reason to change. But as I've often said, both sides are coming at this with good intentions. And those who would argue for it would say that there are circumstances where pain and suffering is just so completely intolerable. And actually I can anticipate and imagine that. But the interesting thing is that the pain is very rarely physical. It's mental. It's a sense of being a burden on people. It's a sense that your life no longer has value. And I can sort of understand that. The corollary or the flip side, of course, is that when we come across people who feel a burden or hopeless, we tend to try to help them. We don't try to end their lives.
I feel as if the argument put forward is hard to see it as a tangible thing that, this is what's going to happen. This is what, we pass this bill, this is what's going to happen, rather than the what's actually, in the bill or whatever. How are we supposed to, as New Zealanders, to accept that this is what is going to happen? If you get what I'm
Yeah. Look, first and foremost, it's a bill. It's a concept. It is very difficult to say definitively what will happen in New Zealand, but we're helped out by overseas jurisdictions. We don't have to look very far, be it Oregon in the United States or Canada most recently, and certainly in the Benelux countries, so the likes of Belgium and Netherlands, to see how these laws pan out. And they all start out under the argument of choice, And that's how they open the door to this concept that actually ending your life in certain circumstances is acceptable. We see that there's an instant uptake of it, and the numbers grow and always continue to grow. In other words, more and more people take the option, and the reasons develop. And a really quick example is the likes of Belgium, which started out for terminal illness and effectively for people, older people, and now you can basically euthanise for a whole variety of reasons, including mental illness, and they're euthanising children.
Obviously, such a massive, strong outcry against it last time. How is it disappointing to see this come before Parliament now?
Actually, for me, it's not so much disappointing as predictable. I find with areas like this, there's always just a constant pressure. So I know some are disappointed or even disillusioned, like, oh, why do we have to do this again? But I found with this sort of topic, it just keeps coming back. So even if this one's defeated, I'm sure there'll be a push to have it happen again. So I sort of operate from a position of constant vigilance on these sort of ethical topics.
We go to safeguards now, and I know you talked that, in fact, safeguards is the wrong word to use because it's inapplicable for a case like this when you argue, 17 and a half versus 18, what's the difference?
Yeah.
How could that be amended, or why is that there, for instance?
Look, fundamentally, I've argued, and I think for good reason, that there are no safeguards, and I would say that of any law across the world, and certainly with this one being proposed in New Zealand, people mix up criteria for safeguards. So being 18, as the bill prescribes, is not a safeguard, that's a criteria. I suppose that arguably makes a 17-year-old safe, but yeah, it's a criteria. Being terminally ill is a criteria, there's no safeguard there. Even going and seeing the doctors, that's a process, that's a criteria. Again, it's not a safeguard. The bill actually, if you look at it legally and quite closely, is almost if I could put it this way, a conveyor belt. Once you seek euthanasia or assisted suicide, you start moving through a process, a mandated process, which only has one conclusion, and that's to end your life. It's not going to try and direct you specifically into other forms of care, palliative or otherwise. It's a process and a set of criteria to take you towards that end-of-life choice, as it's called. Again, it doesn't have any safeguard process in it.
What a lot of people can't get their head around is when you see such suffrage in hospitals and whatnot, and you have that hypothetical argument where someone is in extreme pain and they can't be put out of their misery in a way like that. How is that humane to argue that?
Actually, in those incredibly rare circumstances, I don't think it is humane to say that this should absolutely continue. But from my own experience in hospitals, but drawing more particularly on the doctors and nurses who are literally seeing thousands and thousands of patients, say that, a lot of the doctors that came before our committee said they don't see these horrid stories of extreme pain, that actually modern palliative care can manage this. And one of the tensions have been people's experiences from 10, 15, 20 years ago to what actually modern palliative care can do now, which is actually manage that pain. A lot of it more emotional, spiritual, mental than physical. So yeah, I have to draw on, if you will, the experience of the doctors and the nurses who say to me that these exceptions are rare if not actually happening now. They can be managed, but I would also add that where you do come across those incredibly rare cases where there is intolerable, terrible suffering, we can actually engage that process and discussion around end of life, but that's not a reason to change the law which affects everybody.
How can you say to someone who's seen their mother, their grandmother, someone who is an influential figure in their lives go through immense pain, and I try to talk about it too, that it's actually not about that, it's about the whole situation, but it's very hard to not focus on that. What do you say to someone like that that's gone through that?
Oh, I think those who have gone through it, you've got to acknowledge the reality of it, the pain of it. I think it's real, and it's twofold in a way, because not only have their loved ones gone through a terrible situation, but they themselves are now suffering because of that. So I think one has to be incredibly empathetic. I think we have to learn, we have to listen, but particularly as a politician, you've got to realise that you're not just dealing with that particular case. Your duty, your responsibility is to look at laws which are going to affect everybody. So I suppose for someone like me, it's about listening to those stories, acknowledging the pain of those stories, and allowing that, along with other stories, to come to a particular conclusion around a law that's going to affect everybody.
Can you talk us through that select committee that you ran, and just give us a big understanding of that?
Yeah, so I was the chair of the health committee for 3 years, and what turned out to be the largest piece of work was a petition that came before Parliament asking for effectively an inquiry, a discussion, a public discussion about euthanasia and strictly ending one's life. So the select committee, and there were 9 of us, basically undertook an inquiry which took about 2 and a bit years. We ended up with 21,000 New Zealanders writing in, pretty much all uniquely. In other words, there were no forms sent in. It was individual people writing their thoughts, and about 75-80% were opposed to the idea of euthanasia-assisted suicide. But we also chose from about 1,800 people, 1,800 wanted to be heard, and we ended up hearing from about 1,000 of those. In other words, we heard from everyone who wanted to be heard. We couldn't contact some people. So over hours and hours of hearings, we got to hear the stories from both sides, and the experts and the ethicists, the doctors, and we were able to write up a report which certainly didn't endorse introducing euthanasia laws, but a report which in effect articulated the arguments as best we could. I often refer to it as distilling 21,000 submissions, 1,000 people's voices into a 40, 50-page document where all the key arguments are there, and it's my hope that actually that report's quite useful to current MPs to engage this topic.
Seymour argues the contrary in terms of public support for euthanasia. What are we supposed to believe in terms of a select committee or polls that may be biased but still have a compelling figure against, or rather for, euthanasia? Yeah,
so one side makes a big thing of numbers. I actually am not so interested in polls and numbers, and it doesn't matter what the topic is. I think we're there to do what's right, not what's necessarily popular. And again, that goes on a whole range of topics. I mean, 90% in polls want to smack their children. I don't think that's the right thing to do. Simply what polls come up with is not an argument in itself. Similarly, for me with the euthanasia inquiry, the fact that, as I said, 75-80% were against isn't the fundamental argument itself. I suppose the real critical point around polls, and particularly the ones that come out that there's 70-75% support for euthanasia, is there's 2 problems with it. The first is a lot of people actually don't know what is and isn't euthanasia. So when you actually drill down, and the other side never talks about this, when you ask someone, "Oh, you're for euthanasia?" Yeah. What do you think it is? Turning off life support? Oh yeah, that's euthanasia. And you go, no, it's not. Withdrawing fluids and food from someone, is that euthanasia? They go, oh yeah, that is. No, it's not. In other words, people don't understand when they're answering yes what euthanasia is. What they perceive it to be is quite different from what it actually is. And then, if I might, people have an almost utopian perfection view of what euthanasia is. If you then say to that 75%, so you're happy euthanizing the disabled, the number begins to drop. They go, oh no, I only want it for the terminally ill. And you're going, the terminally ill at 6 months or 12 months? Are you okay euthanizing children, the mentally ill? It all begins to fracture, because there are people who are very comfortable with euthanizing children, the mentally ill, the disabled, and then there are those that are not. So I suppose in a long way I'm suggesting that when we rely on just a simple poll, do you like euthanasia or not, we're missing all the complexities, and we're overlooking that a lot of people don't actually understand what it means.
So if this goes to referendum, what's going to happen?
I would hope there's a really big public debate, but a lot of the views or misunderstandings are quite well entrenched. So I wouldn't be able to completely predict where a referendum would go, but I would hope a lot of New Zealanders would educate themselves, because the Select Committee report itself said a lot of people in New Zealand don't fully understand suffering, dying and death, and they certainly don't fully understand what euthanasia means.
So, a conscience vote in the House, and I've asked you this before, in the sense that, for instance, your electorate comes out and says, we want it, overwhelmingly, and you're sitting in the House of Representatives. Do you have to represent them or represent the studies that you've done?
You represent both in a way. I've always been of the position that I vote according to my conscience, but one that's informed. So obviously through my own research and reading and engagement with the experts, but also engaging with my electorate. So I do spend a lot of time around these sorts of topics, and did it with the drinking age and other things as well, talking to constituents of a variety of views. In fact, I tend to bias myself towards those who are different to my opinion. In other words, I have constituents come in, or I go and meet constituents who have the opposite view to me, so I can get a better understanding from their perspective. I'm quite fortunate locally that actually the electorate's not swinging wildly one way or another. The views are quite nuanced. But to use your thought experiment, if in this case all my electorate wanted me to vote for it, but I felt I couldn't, then I would still vote against it. Fundamentally, they did elect me, who came along with a set of values and judgments, and on conscience issues, at the day's end, I have to stand on both feet and vote what I think is right, and ultimately then stand up in front of the electorate and justify it.
New Zealand's typically progressive and historic in passing laws, tends to be the first in a lot of things. Can you talk to me about the historic decisions that New Zealand have had, and whether this is just going to be another one?
I think a lot of people try to frame this as a progressive issue. If progressivism is simply about turning everything on its head, then euthanasia certainly is. We've gone from, we shouldn't be allowing anyone to end their lives, to being now progressive, and we just have to change things. Then yes, it is a progressive issue. Personally, I think it's the absolute step backwards. A civilised society doesn't end people's lives. And to try and link it to the women's vote and stuff, to me, as some have tried to do, is a little bit odd. It's hard for me to say much more than that. I just don't see it as a progressive issue at all.
Interesting fact with the MPs that voted against it in the first reading, they all have some form of religious connectivity. How can we justify the religious argument?
Look, I actually don't think this is a religious issue. I think a lot of mischief is made in this space, that somehow this is an argument of religion versus rationalism, which it just isn't. In fact, when I look at colleagues who voted both for and against, a lot of them hold religious views. And even when I think of the Select Committee inquiry, I think only about 4% of people writing in expressed religious views, and interestingly, most of them were for the pro side, sort of shadowboxing religious arguments. So, look, fundamentally, this isn't a religious issue. People are welcome to approach it from a religious point of view, a belief system. But fundamentally, just because one group of people believe something doesn't imply a duty or responsibility on others. I mean, fundamentally, this is an ethical and by its nature a medical issue, and that's where I personally engage it.
The church in New Zealand, the Catholic Church, is in huge opposition to this. The Bishops' Conference, meeting, and now putting out in every parish around New Zealand, people talking, videos, and major means to write submissions. Is that okay?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, every group, every individual has the right to speak up. I think it's actually a little bit concerning in some of the narrative or the discussion, particularly in media, that somehow some groups shouldn't be allowed to have a voice. And I think in a really, truly progressive and democratic society, every group has the right to speak. And the Catholics seem to get a fair whack of the stick on this. but I think it's important to point out that a lot of people from various other Christian traditions, certainly the Jewish and the Muslim community, the Buddhist community, the Hindu and Sikh community, are also very unhappy with the bill. I would also point actually a lot of people of non-belief, a lot of atheists are against this as well. They see this as actually a very right-wing life as having some sort of commoditable value. They reject it as well. So maybe put it this way, there are people with religion for it, there are people with religion against it, there are people who are atheists who are for it, people who are atheists who are against it, and I think it's just a broad range of views.
You mentioned right wing.
Yeah.
Is this going to be a right wing, left wing issue?
I think for some it is. When I've talked to some of my left wing colleagues, part of their objection is they see this as sort of a right wing, a capitalist concept. Life has a value, it's a commodity, it can be sort of, in a sense, bought and sold, or in this case, given and then taken away. It's attributing a value to life, and they see that as quite a problem. And I can sort of understand that, even as a centre-right politician. I do reject the notion that life somehow runs out of value and therefore can be disposed of.
New Zealand's history of euthanasia, can you talk through that?
So there's been two bills before, I believe, one under the name of a guy called Peter Brown and one called Michael Laws. They weren't quite as broad as this one, but both have been defeated. I think the last one by, only one vote. My understanding, because I wasn't in Parliament at the time, that generally they start a bit like this one with a lot of support, but as people begin to think about the issue and think about the wider consequences, because no law is perfect, they get a bit more nervous. I think it's interesting to point out with the Health Select Committee, we had a whole wide range of views on that committee, but it's interesting at the end of it, and with the most recent vote, bar two, all the others, some who had been for euthanasia, voted against it at first reading.
The notion of choice in today's society is massive.
Yep.
Where we have a choice to do anything we want to.
Mm-hmm.
And there's obviously a risk of public safety. And can you talk through that?
So choice is probably the strongest argument in favour of euthanasia, and sometimes wrapped up in words like autonomy, or even concepts of dignity and how I want to choose and define my life. Society always, though, limits choice. You don't have a choice to wear a seatbelt. You don't have a choice to wear a bike helmet, and I can't choose to drive on the other side of the road. So we've always limited choice to a degree, and we primarily do that for public safety. And so while we can probably understand why some people may want this choice to have euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, people like myself see that particular choice puts a whole lot of other people at risk, at danger. Those that are lonely, depressed, feel a burden. And it's one of my primary concerns that those people won't have a choice. So the choice of some will end up taking away the choice from a lot. And the other thing I'd point out, that actually with euthanasia, the patient never makes the choice. I think it's one of the falsities in this debate. The doctor makes the choice. You've got to go to the doctor and effectively ask their permission to end their life, and the doctor and the medical team decide whether you can have that choice or not, and then in effect they decide when you go. So this argument that it's my choice is a bit quirky to me.
Clause 4, what does it mean?
So clause 4 is around who's eligible and who's not. And so clause 4 talks about terminal illness, which I think most of us can understand, but I could point out there's a lot of conditions which are terminal but not immediately life-threatening. Secondly, it talks about grievous and irremediable conditions. Now, in the first instance, we all go, oh yes, grievous and irremediable. But actually, what is grievous and irremediable? And I'm pushing a long way out here, but male pattern baldness, alopecia, is irremediable by and large. So I know we're not talking about that, but I'm just trying to point out that those terms are incredibly vague, incredibly ambiguous. And anyone who works in the medical field will tell you it's very hard to define. So to someone like me, clause 4 just begins to open the door incredibly widely to who's involved. So when proponents say, oh, it's very narrow, it's not. You can't read clause 4 and say it's narrow. And the third part of Clause 4 is that it's about suffering that you deem intolerable. So instantly this becomes quite a subjective decision. If the patient says, I can't tolerate this, then they're well on their way to be able to have euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. And I think that takes us down very much the Belgian route, which is pushing at the moment to say, look, if someone's just tired of life, they've had enough, they should be able to go to the doctor and get the lethal injection.
Now, David Seymour said on the AM show, Duncan Garner, not too long ago, that there's a hell of a lot of fear-mongering by various groups around this and what's happening overseas. He doesn't really believe what is happening overseas is happening. But from your investigations, what is happening overseas?
Well, if we look at, there's been a massive expansion overseas with euthanasia. Once it's introduced, and so by euthanasia I'm now using it actually quite broadly, both physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia. You take the pill, the doctor terminates you. It starts narrow and goes broad. So what we see from overseas is an increase in numbers of people euthanized. It becomes normalised, just becomes an accepted part of medical care. We see it broadening in terms of who is eligible. So the likes of Belgium are now euthanizing children, and that was never anticipated when the bill was first, or the law was first introduced. We are seen in the Benelux countries to a push to, and it will succeed, I would suggest, that just feeling a burden, feeling that your life's up is enough reason. We're seeing people now with mental illnesses. So I think about 3 weeks ago, a 29-year-old woman who was basically just post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, euthanized. So she just wasn't coping with life and she was terminated. So there's no fear-mongering. I mean, this is not me making up stories. These are published facts of what's happening. Canada passed the law about a year ago for euthanasia, and there's already a challenge now to expand that from terminal illness to mental illness for the same arguments. It's about choice, their sense of dignity, their sense of worth. And if that's the basis that you have euthanasia, then why is it limited to just the terminally ill? So there isn't fear-mongering, there's just a natural expansion.
Legislation differences from this bill to those in overseas states?
There's points of commonality in this bill, particularly around the reporting stages. These bills or laws in other countries make a big thing of their reporting. And so there's pages and pages of what has to happen with reporting. The fundamental fact that sometimes gets overlooked is the person's dead. So you can do all the paperwork that you want, but again, person's finished, gone. You can't bring them back. And all that reporting is not a safeguard. Again, it's often put forward, oh, look at all these reports. What's also similar is the falsifying of death records. That's seen a lot of legislation overseas. You're not actually allowed to put on the death certificate that the person received a lethal injection. You've got to hide that fact, so that's something that's quite common. Probably what is different in the New Zealand legislation is just how broad it is. Again, both forms of euthanasia and the fact that it is a quite wide arc of who gets captured by that, so not just the terminally ill.
What do you say to the people that say, yeah, maybe not this bill, but why that they agree that there should be extremely tight safeguards around it, but it still be available to those who are in that position of extreme suffering?
Probably two responses in terms of, if there are those points of extreme suffering. One is actually the current law allows that. There are options to withdraw treatment, to withdraw forms of care. That's actually quite acceptable in New Zealand legislation currently. So I suppose I would argue there isn't a need to change to tackle those really hard cases. The other is, and particularly from the medical front, they would say there's been a massive advances in palliative care, that we don't actually have a need for euthanasia. There's a whole myriad of options, and they would advocate quite strongly, as I have been too, that New Zealand actually needs to continue to improve its palliative care, and in particular to make sure there's equitable access across the country, because there isn't at the moment.
Why is it such a polarising issue?
Well, it's about life and death. I think when you get into the range of ethical or moral issues. When you get into issues of life and death, people get pretty uptight about it. And I think personally, from my own experience of being around a lot of suffering and death for various reasons, partly also as my background and work, hospitals and hospices, but there's a lot of fear. Suffering's not a nice thing, none of us want it. And so there is, I think, a natural agitation or fear about it, and the notion of dying as well. And I think that plays a big part in making it such a polarising issue.
Do you think with your background that you've developed a major bias behind it?
I don't think so. I mean, you can always be accused of bias. I mean, I have a clear position, but it's one that's been based on experience. So being at many a deathside bed, be it the hours or days beforehand and all that happens there, and people dying and with family around. So yeah, for me it's an experiential field. And then there's been the academic side. A lot of my postgraduate work's been in philosophy and the nature of liberalism and ethics. So I've sort of looked at the issues on that front. So that's where I formed my perspectives from.
Why do you think you're qualified to have the opinion that you do?
I think when you're dealing with a life and death issue, everyone's qualified to have an opinion. So I don't see myself as anything particularly unique. I think I've been fortunate, particularly through my parliamentary career and being on that enquiry, that along with the other MPs, an almost unique perspective of reading and listening to thousands and thousands of people's testimony, their particular experiences, and to listen to expert after expert, again from both sides. So I don't think I'm in any particularly unique position. I think we all have and have the right to opinions. I've just been fortunate to hear a lot of them, and that's helped me form my views, and anyone who knows me knows that I'm never shy of sharing my opinion.
And what's your hope for this bill?
I hope to see it defeated. I think this is a dangerous bill, an unnecessary bill in New Zealand. I think ultimately we can do much better by those suffering and dying through better palliative care, more care and more hope. I don't believe actually a lethal injection is ever the right response to suffering.